Good afternoon and welcome to the University of St. Thomas School of Law. It is a privilege and a pleasure to have you here. I know we're all busy and it means a lot that you took time out of your schedule to join us for this important conversation, Finding Common Ground Between Public Safety and Racial Justice, all for the common good. I'm Rob Vischer. I'm the dean here at the law school. I have to say a word of gratitude to our co-sponsors for today's event, the Murphy Institute and the Holleran Center, and a special word of thanks to Tom and Patty Holleran, who have joined us today for this conversation. I invite all of you to extend your time here talking about these important issues tonight by joining us after the program for a light reception. I'm confident that this will be just one of many programs to be held throughout the Twin Cities community exploring this critically important intersection of public safety and criminal justice and racial justice. As a Catholic university, it is vitally important that St. Thomas be a champion for these conversations. If universities exist only to enhance workforce readiness or conduct socially beneficial research, we have settled for an incomplete vision of higher education's potential. Pope John Paul II described a Catholic university as an authentic community with a common dedication to the truth and a common vision of the dignity of the human person. Now is the time, in the midst of seemingly intractable racial strife, when we need to demonstrate what this means in the real world and why it matters. Earlier this year, the Star Tribune did a survey on Black Lives Matter. 6% of white Minnesotans had a favorable view of the group, while 94% of black Minnesotans had a favorable view of the group. Those statistics are remarkable and sobering. We come to this conversation from very different vantage points on a range of difficult, often painful issues. Our goal tonight is not to reach consensus, but to listen and learn from each other. In doing so, we are resisting the increasingly common tendency to choose sides and then treat that choice as the end of moral reflection on the matter. Instead, we must aspire to help one another walk in the shoes of those on both sides who are too easily demonized, to help translate justifiable anger into social change, and to help build bridges across the racial divide. Not through arm's-length pronouncements, but through the messiness of mutual understanding. It requires long, difficult work to permit your story to shape my story, but it is work that has never been more important. I'll now turn the program over to one of our moderators, School of Law Distinguished Senior Fellow, Hank Shea. Thank you all for joining us.
Let me begin by just summarizing the format, which is not apparent from your programs, and how we're going to proceed today. The first hour will be a series of presentations, initial remarks by each of our invited speakers. And we did it in two groups because it's difficult to sit up in these chairs for 2 hours. But the second hour is where we're really hoping to have an engaged dialogue. And we'll have all 8 of us up here. Mark Ostler, my colleague here at St. Thomas, will be co-moderating the question and answer section of the event. No cards should be available either on your seats or when you came in. Please write out a question and at some point hold them up. Students will collect them throughout the event. They'll be brought up here and we'll get to as many questions as possible in that second hour. And for those questions we can't get to, we hope you'll stay for the reception at 6 o'clock afterwards so we can continue the conversation. But it's now my honor and privilege to introduce the 3 speakers I have to my left, to your right here today. Dr. Cedric Alexander is at the far end. As you can read in the program, he has had an amazing career in law enforcement. Some of you may recognize him from CNN. He's a regular there as a law enforcement analyst. He's also the head of public safety for DeKalb County in Atlanta, Georgia. What's not in the bio are some interesting facts that he got a bachelor's and a master's from a school now known as St. Thomas University in Miami, Florida. And then after some other years, he went to Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, and got his doctoral degree in clinical psychology. And I'm guessing he's one of the very few, maybe the only police head in the country with a PhD in clinical psychology. In addition to being on CNN, he's appeared on ABC, CBS, and NBC nightly news programs. In the middle is Mike Freeman. Many of you recognize him as our Hennepin County attorney. 17 years, I guess it'll be 18 years at the end of this year, he has served Hennepin County as the chief county attorney. The program sets out in detail what it means to be the chief executive of the largest public law office in the state. Mike received his bachelor's from Rutgers University and his law degree from the University of Minnesota Law School. And seated right next to me is Chief Mike Goldstein. He's the Director of Public Safety for Plymouth, Minnesota. The program details his extensive involvement in associations, committees, task forces, all throughout the state of Minnesota. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of St. Thomas in criminal justice. He received his master's from the University of St. Thomas in public safety, education, and administration, and he also is an adjunct professor at the University of St. Thomas. So please join me in greeting our three initial speakers. So welcome to you all. Dr. Alexander, let's start with you and briefly tell us why you took the time to come up from Atlanta, Georgia today to be here in Minneapolis.
Well, to be quite honest with you, had I known the weather was this great, I would have left Atlanta earlier because it's been a hot, blistering summer there. But anyway, thank you. And I also would like to thank the law school and Professor Shea and everyone who's responsible for inviting me to be here today, to be here with you. And this is my second visit to Minneapolis this year. I was here earlier this year in February, which I had a totally different experience. But it is great to be back here and great to be among a great community as well, too, as Minneapolis and all the surrounding areas. But part of my journey over the last number of years in the profession, both as a psychologist and as a law enforcement official, really kind of merged together unknowingly, without any real plan of it. When I left policing years ago, my goal was to be a psychologist and stay there, having had been in the profession about 15 years. But life, as we all know, takes us down different roads. And for me, it brought me back into the law enforcement profession, not knowing that one day, in August of 2014, a name that we all came so familiar with, Michael Brown, and all the subsequent events that took place after that, just became more of a tipping point of a social issue in this country that has been going on for a very, very long time. In fact, ever since the beginning of policing. So part of what I try to do as I travel across this country, and grateful of being here today, is really to share some of my thoughts and ideas and experiences that I have had in terms of how I think about advancing policing and community in this country. I think we all would agree that we're in this very unusual place in America's history on a lot of different fronts. But if we think specifically about police and community, I think we all would agree that that is a very challenge and still a very volatile situation that we live in every day. But the most important part of all of this is we all have identified what much of the problem has been. The greatest challenge we're going to have going forward, as I stated to about a dozen law students here today during lunch, is finding resolution and resolve around some of America's oldest and still most pervasive social issues that affect us as a nation today. And even coming into a new year where we're going to have new leadership at a national level, and the challenges and the thoughts and the perceptions that we all have as we struggle through this election process is going to be paramount. But at the end of the day, they will only hold an office for X period of time. But for the citizens of this nation, across this great nation, and the diversity that it stands and it stands for, I think this is a great time for our young people, our students, all of us as Americans to meet this challenge that is in front of us. and attempt to find a way to resolve. Oftentimes we would hear that in this country we don't talk enough about race. And my thought about that, quite frankly, is this, is that we have not talked about it. It is a very difficult and challenging subject to talk about. It is a subject that is fueled with our own experiences in terms of how we were raised and what our histories may happen to be, wherever we may happen to be from and how we got to this nation. And so it becomes very complex and convoluted. But I think at some point, it is a conversation we as everyday Americans have to have with each other, taking ourselves out of our own comfort zone. But what I think is most important in this day and time that we live in, particularly being a country that is under attack, if you will, because we know that there are people out there that's trying to do harm to us. And no more important time in America's history is it is important for police and community to be together. Because as a country, as a nation, we're only as strong as our partnerships in our communities and we as Americans. And what I would suggest is that we talk in our conversations, which would be a lot easier to do and a lot less threatening to everyone, is to share our ideas and our values that we all share as Americans. And I think as Americans, we all want the same thing. We want healthy neighborhoods, we want good schools, we want the best for our children, the best for ourselves. We want safe communities. We want opportunities for economic success, and we want opportunities for our children to have a good education and have a good jump start in life. Those are the values that every one of us in this room share. And those are the things I think that are critically important for us to talk about. But throughout this evening, I hope we get an opportunity to talk about and share what it is that we're going to do going forward in order to bring about some change, particularly as it relates to police and community. And how do we advance policing? And how do we advance our communities in this year and the years to come? This is a very critical point in America's history, and it's a very defining point, but I think it's also a very exciting point where we all can be part of something that is truly, truly bigger than all of us together. And as a nation, and as a country, and as Americans, I think we share and have an opportunity here to create a country that has been greater than ever before, and where it's also great for everyone. Not looking backwards, but looking forward in terms of how do we move past our differences and accept more of the things that we do share in common, because quite frankly, as we get to know people who are much different than ourselves, we will find that we share more similarities than we do differences. And that takes courage as well, too. Thank you, and thank you for having me.
So, Chief Goldstein, would you be willing to give us the local law enforcement perspective on how you maintain public safety while also achieving justice for all citizens in Minnesota?
I'd be happy to. And I think because I barely fit in this chair with all of this on, I'm going to go over here for a moment. I want to thank the university for the opportunity to be here. St. Thomas is near and dear to my heart, and it's a real honor to be before all of you today. I want to build on Dr. Alexander's comments, and I hope that some of the reflections that I offer provide some more concrete examples of what we're doing in our organization and what I hope other departments will do, if they're not already doing so, to help bridge this important gap that we need to bridge. I need to offer the following preface. I'm speaking from my professional experience, than that I represent the city of Plymouth, Plymouth Public Safety Department. I sit on many boards. I'm one of the vice presidents of our Chiefs Association here in Minnesota, but I'm not speaking on their behalf today. I'm speaking from my perspective. I think it's really good that we're here. It's really important that we're here. And my friend, who is an assistant special agent in charge at the FBI, his name is Brian Turner. And Brian has a lot of opportunities to engage with community in his role. And he talks about in order for us to build a bridge, which is what we're trying to do today, you have to start on each side and meet in the middle. So I hope that's the premise that we can start with. So the question I've been asked to address is finding common ground between maintaining public safety and achieving racial justice. So if we have to find common ground, the supposition is that it currently does not exist, or that it does not exist in an ideal manner. Under the original intent of how American law enforcement was established, it's really unfortunate that we have to even answer that question, right, or ask it. Our law enforcement system was founded on the same principles that established the London Metropolitan Police Department under the leadership of Sir Robert Peel. Under his still very relevant principles, he stated, "The public are the police, and the police are the public." The public are the police, and the police are the public. Police officers are part of the community and should not be apart from the community. We need to have that understanding. Police need to recognize this. Community members need to recognize this. We are working towards a common good together. The police and the citizenry must have mutual respect in order for the policing system to be effective. There must be local control and limited authority of the police. And from my experience, I believe this exists, right? In many communities across the country, and certainly the community that I represent. I believe that there's more success than failure in American law enforcement, but I'm keenly aware that the overall ideal of why we're here today has not been reached. While racial injustice may unfortunately exist in some circumstances, it is not a practice that I condone or tolerate. And as I stated in a recent article in the Star Tribune, I'm disappointed that we as a society have not evolved further than we have. So I want to kind of offer the following premise. Like other professions, law enforcement is an evolving industry, and from my perspective, is entering into a new era. Since the mid-1800s, American law enforcement has undergone a metamorphosis through three different eras: the political era, the reform era, and the professional era. And I'm not sure other segments of the criminal justice system have gone through that many changes. With the many events over the last couple of years, as Dr. Alexander pointed out, starting in August of 2014, I believe America is headed into a new era. And despite the many difficulties and challenging circumstances that currently exist, I am encouraged that through constructive dialogue and thoughtful consideration, law enforcement, in conjunction with the community support, will enter into this new era that is supported by a seminal document, the Presidential Task Force's 21st Century Policing Report, that was created through a nonpartisan effort. For the first time in recent history, there is a common platform for all law enforcement agencies to adhere to, as this important report is a critical roadmap for all law enforcement organizations across the United States. But I have to make a distinction here. Whether you agree or not, Minnesota law enforcement is ahead of the pack. Minnesota is the only state in the country that requires a college degree for its police officers, and the training standards within this state are further advanced than one you'll find in many other states across this great country. With the establishment of the Minnesota Post Board in 1979, the legislature empowered the Post Board to license peace officers and to set certain training and policy development requirements that all officers in Minnesota must adhere to and all organizations must adhere to. And this also includes the educational and training objectives that higher education must also meet, as higher ed is Minnesota's gateway into this vocation. So here's the crux of all of this, right? While Minnesota is unique, we cannot rest on our laurels. As such, the 21st Century Policing Report provides a foundation for all law enforcement agencies to strive for. For many of us in Minnesota, some of the aspects of this report and its recommendations are not necessarily novel. But for others across the country, it sets a common denominator. Again, for the first time, there is a carefully crafted and well-vetted document that outlines the best policing practices for all agencies to strive for. For those who are not familiar with the document, it has 6 main sections, or what the authors call pillars: building trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology and social media, community policing and crime prevention, or crime reduction, training and education, and officer wellness and safety. In Plymouth, these pillars have been the cornerstone for our success. Are we perfect? No. But we do believe in continuous improvement. In our organization, we practice servant leadership. Our personnel selection process seeks out those who have a natural desire to serve. They are people of character who put people first, that exhibit foresight, and who lead with moral authority. We, like other departments, have established credibility, and legitimacy with our community through our transparency, open channels of communication, dedication to uncommon service, and prudent oversight, and great training. Our training includes de-escalation techniques, and we've been doing that for a couple of decades. Further, we have and will continue to train on mental health crisis issues, cultural competency, and other mandated training requirements. And every officer in our organization has been trained in the 21st Century Policing Report. But the one element that I want to highlight as it relates to the report has to do with officer wellness and safety. Let me set the stage. People do not call 911 to tell us it's their birthday. They don't call us to say, hey, I got promoted today. They call us with a problem. We are the only, right, wrong, or indifferent, 24/7 social service agency that is typically available. Our calls for service range from the mundane to the high-profile critical incidents, from broken water heaters to animal complaints to theft reports to heart attacks to domestic violence calls. And as such, our personnel must wear many hats: that of a social worker, a chemical health professional, a mental health crisis worker, an emergency medical technician, a hometown security specialist, a parent, a guardian, and from time to time, yes, a warrior. It's not an easy task, and in some cases, split-second and life-saving decisions must be made, and not just by the most senior management levels, but by those on the lowest rung of the organizational ladder, which happens to be the most important rung on the ladder. What I hope is that we can take the conversations that we're getting through this interaction to provide a better future than what we have today. I've been told I need to stop because I have a few more things to say, and I'll get to those later. But the one thing that I need to point out is this. At a recent community engagement with the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, and other local law enforcement leaders, we were meeting with faith leaders in North Minneapolis, who are from North Minneapolis, and they stated that they want good policing, but that they cannot have broken police officers policing their streets. If we want to find common ground, we have to provide a healthy environment for our officers, and I'll speak to that later. That's one of the stepping stones that we need to do on our side. And again, I don't like calling sides because we're in this together, but with that, I think we'll find success moving forward where we can find common ground and build a brighter future. Thank you.
Nice job, Mike.
So Mike Freeman will give us the challenges as well as the efforts underway to find this intersection between public safety and racial justice.
Being in a law school, as a long time ago law student, I'm supposed to follow the rules. Professor, I'm not sure I'm going to follow your rules. Because I want to start with some of the basics, because it seems to me that fairness and justice in communication begins at home and in the office. And we in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, as the largest public law office in the state of Minnesota, strive very hard to do that. I want to talk about 3 themes today: enhancing communication and understanding, education and review of practices and procedures, and expanding opportunities for peaceful and creative dialogue. To do our job right, prosecutors must continually enhance communication and understanding. That's why I made the decision to discontinue the use of the grand jury in police cases involving deadly force that result in the death of a civilian. Why? 23 citizens might be a superior determiner of facts than one prosecutor, but we don't know who that 23 citizens are, and you do know who that one prosecutor is, and you can hold him or her accountable at the ballot box. The second is the whole question of transparency. By history, tradition, and statute, grand juries are private. That's one of the strengths of the grand juries. It's also one of its severe misgivings and limitations today. Because if you use a grand jury, you cannot say what evidence was presented to that grand jury. In a recent case, when we announced the decision, we had a 60-page report on the facts, a detailed explanation of the law, all the police reports, all the forensic evidence, including DNA, the autopsy, everything we had, with the exception of what the feds have and they won't share, we released. So each of you can go to our website and decide and review the facts of the decision I made. Because of the lack of accountability or transparency, we won't use a grand jury in a police officer case again. This is breaking with a tradition of 40 years in this county and 900 years since early Britain. But today's requirements require some new directions, so that is the direction we're taking. The second point is education and review of practices. Well, when I became Hennepin County Attorney, 3% of our lawyers were people of color. That might have reflected the population in Hennepin County in 1991, but it certainly doesn't today. And today we have over 19% of our lawyers are people of color, and we're going to do even better. Because if you're a Somali individual who's been victimized in a case, and the first person you see in the county attorney's office is a victim witness advocate who wears the same clothes and speaks the same language as you do, that's helpful. In a similar fashion, if you're charged with a serious crime and your lawyer is talking about the other lawyer and you notice if you're African American, he's African American, I think that's positive because we have some common ground to build on. We have better mentoring, we have better performance management, we have better instruction than ever before. You know, when I first became county attorney in 1991, the transgender movement had just begun. It was not well understood. And we have had cases with transgender individuals. Well, we brought in specific transgender people to help us understand the culture and things we need to be concerned about. In a similar fashion, most of us are aware that implied bias exists in all of us. And we're going to have a nationally known expert talking to every single person in the county attorney's office, from attorneys to paralegals to secretaries, because we need to understand better dealing with that phenomenon. We need to evaluate what we do. We brought in an outside agency to evaluate whether there was racial bias in our charging or in our disposition of juvenile cases. And with one exception, diversion, they found no explicit bias. And we're working to resolve the question of diversion, which really was a communication one. In adults' cases, we've always used diversion. Diversion is not going forward with a case, allowing the person to work through the issues they had. Society perhaps will request some sentence to service or other things, but trying to keep it out of the criminal justice system. If we do it pre-charging, there is no criminal record. That means a juvenile in particular or low-level adult offender keeps their record clear. It's not that many people are using that record against them, but some are. And once it gets out in the data world, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. What we can do is make sure there was never a record in the first place. Or let's talk about drug reform. Most of us acknowledge that the claimed war on drugs didn't work. It particularly didn't work for low-level offenders and possessors, many of whom's problem is not greed but addiction. And so I've worked for 6 years to try to get the legislature to finally make some changes. They made this last session to do exactly that. Let's lower the levels of incarceration. Let's lower the consequences for lower-level people and move forward trying to focus on the big-time dealers, which are the real problem. And in my office, well, Minnesota law allows a prosecutor to charge fifth-degree possession, a felony offense, for 1, 2, or 3 pills of OxyContin if you have those in your pocket without prescription. I think that's absurd. Our policy now is that we will not do that except in the rarest of cases. Now let me finish with the most important part of finding common ground. That's dialogue. That's discussion. That's doing what we're doing today. That's sitting down in an era and an aura of mutual respect to try to talk and understand with other people. We try to do that in the county attorney's office. We participate in court watches and neighborhood groups. I personally have reached out to many people on the issue of whether we should disband using the grand juries, and I learned a lot. And I'm thankful for those who spent the time to help educate me. So, what we need is more dialogue, not less. We need it peacefully. We need it with our voices lowered. We need it from both sides. And then we can build on common ground. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go sit down here.
Very good. Very good.
God.
That's fine.
Right here.
Right there. And, okay. Good afternoon. My name's Mark Osler, and I have the privilege of teaching here at St. Thomas. And I also have the privilege this afternoon of introducing our next three panelists, which is a remarkable group. We're first going to hear from Nkechi Taifa, and she's seated in the middle here. She is the Advocacy Director for Criminal Justice at the Open Society Foundations in Washington, D.C. She is a remarkable person. She led the effort to fight the 100-to-1 crack-to-powder ratio in the sentencing guidelines for years, and succeeded in 2010 when the Fair Sentencing Act was passed by Congress. It was a huge change and a rare victory where sentences went down instead of up. She also leads the Justice Roundtable, which is a coalition of groups that meet quarterly. And it's a remarkable thing to be in a room with people from all these different groups working towards a common goal. Within the national discourse, she's been a fierce and persistent voice, and one that I always take care to listen to. And we're lucky to have her here today. Next, we're going to hear from R.T. Rybak, the former mayor of Minneapolis. People may not know this, but he was also a crime reporter for the Minneapolis Tribune, before it was the Star Tribune, even, I believe. And he recently wrote a piece back in August for the Star Tribune that I rarely say this about anything that's in a newspaper, but I agreed with all of it. And one of the things that he wrote that I thought was really remarkable as a clear and plain truth was this: those of us who are white have to finally recognize what black people have known for a long time. We are often treated very differently by the police. And at the far end here is Nekima Levy-Pounds. And Nekima, among other things, did great work here at the University of St. Thomas. She founded the Community Justice Clinic, and also co-founded Brotherhood Incorporated, which works with young black men. She is the president of the Minneapolis NAACP. Like Hank Shea, she's one of the people that when I visited here and I found that she was teaching here, it made me want to move here from Texas and work at St. Thomas. She has what I think is fairly called a prophetic voice. And I mean that in a very simple way. And that is that prophets want people to hear a truth that often they don't want to hear. And she tells that truth. First, we are going to hear from our guest from Washington, Ms. Taifa.
If I need this. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Dean Vischer and the law school for having me here. I want to really personally thank Professor Mark Osler for inviting me to participate on this panel. Over the past few years, we have developed a very strong partnership on a very critical issue, that of the president's clemency power. And I also want to thank you for the opportunity to finally meet someone who you have often said that I should meet, Nekima Levy-Pounds. I'm not quite sure why our paths have not previously crossed in person, but they have surely passed each other in passion. And it's really glad to meet you, RT. Really looking forward to working with you greatly in the future. And I also want to give a special shout out to one of your own. I don't know if she's here today, but actually she is my Shiro, Judge Pamela Alexander, who in the early 90s, she is here. When I was first working on the issue of the disparity between crack and powder cocaine, when no one else was working on that issue, she was the inspiration. I really credit her as the catalyst for really nearly 20 years later. The work that she did in Hennepin County finally was the catalyst for the federal law changing. So I just want to really thank her. This sound is not quite right. Okay. Is it okay to let it lean? Okay.
Some expert advice.
Okay. So let's talk about what we're here to talk about today. About a year ago, my policy associate, a young black woman, Jasmine Mickens, wrote a blog that was published in the Open Society Voices entitled, "I Am Sandra Bland." And it was her personal realization that because of the hue of her skin, there was an increased possibility that during a police encounter, she could become the next hashtag or victim strolling across the banner of CNN. She stated that she fears any interaction with police because she said there is not an outfit, a college degree, a job title, or even a law that could protect her. She states that these never-ending instances of police violence remind her that in our criminal justice system, her life is no more valuable than the pack of CDs Alton Sterling was carrying or the bag of Skittles that Trayvon Martin was carrying. She wrote that she or any of us could be Sandra Bland, the African-American woman who mysteriously died in police custody after asserting her rights after an illegal stop of her vehicle. The lengthy history of police violence against people of color is legion. A colleague, Linda Burnham, provided an excellent historical analysis this summer entitled Baton Rouge, Falcon Heights, and Dallas, and permit me to share just a bit of it at this time. Linda explains that a thick strand in the history of U.S. policing is rooted back in the slave patrols of the 19th century, called paddy rollers. Paddy rollers were authorized to stop, question, search, harass, and summarily punish any black person they encountered. They regularly entered the plantation living quarters of enslaved people, leaving terror and grief in their stead. Together with the hunters of runaways, these patrols had a crystal clear mandate to keep blacks enslaved and root out any possibility of rebellion. How far have we come, really? She questions. Having extricated ourselves from a system of bottomless and blatant cruelty, we have evolved to a system that depends on the paddy rollers of today, i.e. the police, to constrain and contain a population that, while no longer subjected to chattel slavery, is nevertheless ruthlessly exploited, criminally neglected, and justifiably aggrieved. And all of this on top of the foundational failure to financially repair or compensate the formerly enslaved and their descendants. So, today's paddy rollers are expected to contain any overflow of bitterness and anger on the part of the exploited, neglected, and aggrieved, maintaining order in a fundamentally and racially disordered system. And their mandate is as clear as that of their forefathers to constrain a population whose designated role is to absorb exertedly high rates of unemployment and make itself available for low-wage, low-status work without complaint, much less rebellion. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, although the players change and the scene shifts, the script irrefutably remains the same: unequal justice. It doesn't matter whether the issue is vigilantism or police brutality, prosecutorial abuse or unjust sentencing, that as a race, Black people have been subjected to a double standard of justice. Doesn't matter if we're talking about Fred Hampton and Mark Clark of the Black Panther Party, murdered by police in their beds in 1969, Abner Louima, sodomized by police at the police station, the 41 shots pummeled into Amadou Diallo by officers who claimed that they could not tell the difference between a wallet and a gun. Eleanor Bumpers, murdered in her home for resisting eviction. Oscar Grant dead on the BART platform on New Year's Eve. Sean Bell, murdered by police on his wedding day. The difference between the police violence against Blacks of yesterday and that of today can be seen in those 81 seconds of videotape filmed by a private citizen of the vicious beating of Rodney King, which brought into national focus the blatant police brutality that is a tragic part of the African-American experience and ushered in the genesis of the modern age of technology. Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Ayanna Jones, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, police violence against Black teens at a Texas pool party. The list is endless and continues unabated. So we have touched on the history and its continuation down to today, but are there other factors that contribute to the problem of police violence? Absolutely. A variety of other factors on top of the historical context contribute to the problem of police violence, some of which include the increased militarization of local law enforcement, unfettered police discretion, the infamous police code of silence, inadequate disciplinary measures by police departments and administrators, and the ineffectiveness of current remedies. There is a bright spot, and it was touched on earlier. That bright spot is the nonpartisan police task force on 21st century policing, the president's task force, It is a bright spot because those pillars can serve to seek to abate the issues that have been endemic to policing in this country. But I just want to conclude with something very provocative, if I can. And it's something that Linda Burnham said earlier in that article about Baton Rouge and Falcon Heights, et cetera. She says that despite proposed remedies that tells us about narratives and debates about good cops and bad cops, better training, police, community policing, all of that is important, but it is entirely insufficient. She says that no doubt the paddy rollers of the 1850s could have been trained to rein in their brutality. You know, she says whether cruel or kind, restrained or rogue, their job was to police, and by policing maintain a system of inequality. Today's police, she says, as I'm coming to a stop, can be better trained to recognize implicit bias, to dial back on aggression and de-escalate tense encounters. That's critical and great, but none of that changes the core mandate in poor Black communities to control, contain, and constrain by any means necessary a population that has every reason to be rebellious. So I'm just going to conclude. I'm gonna let my colleague come up here and clean my stuff up because we really need a guardian mentality of cops as opposed to a warrior mentality. So, RT, take it away.
And next we'll hear from Mayor Rybak.
If I talk from my seat, can people in the back hear me? Got it.
Yep.
Thank you very much. One of the things that's important in this discussion is to recognize we all bring our own personal experiences to the table. And I think that's one of the things that's important about that, is that unless we do that, we won't recognize that different people bring different experiences. Here's mine. I was the former mayor of Minneapolis, but I was also a white kid in a middle-class neighborhood whose parents owned a drugstore in neighborhoods where our customers were primarily people of color. My family's economic well-being was dependent on African Americans and Native Americans in this community, and that is part of the experience I had. When my father died and my mom ran that drugstore, those relationships continued, but my mother also was held up at gunpoint 2 nights in a row, and I do not think crime is an abstract issue. My experience was as a mayor, and in that case, there are some things that were extraordinarily difficult. I think you saw me on television a lot. I went out to a lot of scenes of crime, and I was at places where there was injustice done, and I saw it with my eyes, and I was in places where there was a desperate plea to please protect my neighborhoods and build a deeper bond with police. I was proud of the work that collectively we as a community did on youth violence prevention, where a community-based effort used a public health approach to get way, way, way upstream and really dramatically drive down crime in this community. And I'm a mayor who believes that the single biggest disappointment of my 12 years in office was the inability to really move the dial on relations with people of color, especially black people in the Minneapolis police. But I think the experience I bring to the table that is most searing to me was the one of a police reporter, 1979, 80, 82, 83, and that whole period. And during that period of time, night after night, going out to crime scenes in different parts of the city, not as a participant, but as an observer, attempting to be as neutral as I could, bringing my stuff to the plate, I saw a couple things. And I saw that there were 2 communities that were not treated equitably by the Minneapolis Police Department. African Americans, especially African American men, and members of the gay and lesbian community. We didn't say GLBT back then. Over the arc of my adult lifetime, part of that changed dramatically, starting with Police Chief Boza and moving forward, a police department that had deep endemic issues with the gay and lesbian community evolved dramatically. I was very proud to appoint one of the first openly lesbian police chiefs in the country, in Janae Hartow, but I didn't have to go very far to find her. She was a deputy chief, and at every level of the police department, there were members of the GLBT community who were deeply in partnership with the community, and the community was part of the department. That tells us there is progress to be made. What also tells us something, however, is during that exact same period of time, relatively little progress was made with the African American community. That does tell us something else, and I believe deeply that part of what that tells us that race matters in this discussion. This is not about fair policing alone. This is about our ability to put race on the table, to understand the extraordinarily complex issues white people have with African Americans and power, both preventing it and harnessing it in a community that is built in part on slave labor. We need to recognize there are deep endemic issues of race, and police departments can't solve them, but they are at the front end of that, and we've got to put race on the table. Before we will not be able, I only have a couple minutes, so I want to get to that point in a little more depth, but there are a number of nuances along with those very big issues we put on the table. Number one, I was elected on 9/11. I won the primary on 9/11, and after 9/11, something dramatic happened. The federal budget, the state budgets plunged, and all of the resources police departments had for community police departments and all the community policing were eviscerated. We had virtually no resources for the community officers, the other people out there building relationships. All of those dollars shifted to Homeland Security, an enormous new responsibility put on police departments. You couldn't find money anywhere for a community police officer, but I could find millions of dollars for tanks and vests and turtle suits. And what happened during that period, often inadvertently, was that police departments in America were militarized with all of the best intentions of dealing with a new responsibility. And one of the last swearing-in ceremonies of police that I looked at, I watched that new class of recruits march up that aisle in military precision and sit down like a well-ordered department and say how great that was that they did that work, but also recognize that we were training people for the wrong job. If we had marched them down with police relations and community relations they had done instead of how they used a turtle suit, we would have gotten much, much further along. It's clear that we have to train a different sort of police officer, but we also have to get real with each other that police officers are protecting us from a lot of things we don't want. Privilege is important in this discussion, especially in the context of race and what white people bring to the table. But there's another privilege we all have as non-police officers, the privilege that my family doesn't have to worry about me walking out on the street because someone else's family member is sending their loved one into harm's way every night. And as somebody who put police officers in harm's way under my direction every single night, we have to get real about what we're asking police to do. That requires a discussion about how much, for starters, we can take off that plate. The drug laws in America are broken. I don't believe in decriminalization. I believe in either having it legal or not. If we decriminalize, we continue to have dollars flowing into the gangs that are making a profit off drugs, and they simply have fewer penalties. Every time a person buys marijuana in this community, you are potentially paying for a bullet that goes into the head of a kid in North Minneapolis. Get real about what our drug use and our drug laws are doing to police, to community, and just get honest about it and solve that. That is one of many, many things we can do. I don't have enough time to get into the other points, but I want to make one final point. It is absolutely true that we need to, quote unquote, bring both sides together. But we need to recognize that this is different. If those two people up there in the balcony got into a fight and one of you was charged to moderate, you'd go up and ask one person their side and another person their side. When you are dealing with an enforcement agency with a majority culture and a minority culture with a history of great disparity, that is not a conversation that people enter into equally. And so those of us who are, I'm running out of time, those of us who are white need to recognize that it's not dangerous to say Black Lives Matter because there really hasn't been that big a threat that white lives don't. We need to recognize that needs to be a very honest conversation in which we begin with the fact that there is disparity in the discussion and we have to depollinize all of that conversation before we move into this. This is a winnable battle, which is a weird thing to say after laying that all on the table. But if any community can do it, we can. But I also believe we need to recognize as we enter into that, we need to understand the privilege of race and the privilege of being protected by people in danger every night. Thank you.
Professor Levy-Towns.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. I want to thank Dean Vischer and my former colleagues, Mark Osler and Hank Shea, for their work in putting this forum together. And thank all of you for engaging in this discussion. I think that it's vitally important that we be willing to have the difficult conversation about race in America, because a lot of the issues that we're talking about surrounding policing are a part of our unreconciled racial history in this country. For some reason, we have the notion that the problems that we talk about in policing are based upon individual circumstances in each case. As a matter of fact, when we look at the videos, we dissect the videos, we have conversations around whether a grand jury should or should not be involved in the case, whether or not the officer was justified in the use of force, whether or not the person was up to no good and they deserve to be killed. I believe that in addition to identifying the specific issues and facts in each case, we have to dissect and unpack the systemic issues that have led to a crisis in policing in the United States and in the state of Minnesota. We are not exempt or immune from the problems with the culture of policing, although we like to pat ourselves on the back and talk about how progressive we are, how educated we are, how wealthy we are in comparison to other states in this country. We have a significant problem surrounding racial injustice in terms of the way that police officers interface with people of color. I witnessed this personally as someone who moved here to the state of Minnesota in 2003 to start teaching at St. Thomas Law School. By 2005, after I put aside the mainstream newspapers and started reading the African American papers, I realized that I had been sold a false sense of reality about the quality of life for African Americans and other people of color in the state of Minnesota. I was told at the time by someone at a different law school about how great Minnesota was, how wonderful it would be, to raise my children here, how our distressed communities aren't so distressed. And that was my mentality for the first couple of years. But as I started reading the African American newspapers, I started to see a completely different side of the story, where there were tremendous disparities across every key indicator of quality of life facing people of color, accounts of police brutality, and also general denial on the part of mainstream Minnesotans about the seriousness of this issue. When we talk about matters of racial injustice and policing, a lot of times we want to look to folks in the South and point the finger as though the problems only exist in the South. But the reality is that in places like Minnesota, we are behind the ball in terms of taking these issues seriously and understanding that what is happening within communities of color represents a serious crisis. And it's a departure from how we articulate how well people are doing in the state of Minnesota. I happen to live in North Minneapolis, which you've heard referenced earlier, and I cannot tell you how distressing it is to drive through the city and constantly see police officers present, and not as officer friendly on many occasions. There are often negative encounters between police and community. I have seen a police officer grab a child around 10 years old by his shirt and slam him on a police car. I was sitting in my car about to go into a building, and I witnessed this myself. And I confronted the officer when I saw that happening, and he said, "Ma'am, you don't know what this child did." And I said, "Sir, there's a system of law to address what this child did, not you taking matters into your own hands and slamming a child on top of a vehicle." I've seen people being pulled out of the windows of their vehicles like they are animals and not humans. When you see these things happening in your own backyard, it's hard to sit back and cast a blind eye and focus just on the letter of the law instead of looking at the spirit of the law. In a lot of these instances, we look at the laws on the books and we say the system will work itself out, that our system of justice is effective, but like St. Augustine said, an unjust law is no law at all. And we have far too many laws on the books that are unjust. If you look at our low-level ordinances in the city of Minneapolis, which mirror low-level ordinances across the nation, we see that we are kicking the poor while they're down. In the city of Minneapolis, until last spring of 2015, it was a crime for people to spit on the sidewalk. My law students at St. Thomas did research about that particular law and other low-level ordinances in the city of Minneapolis. And what we found was that the law against spitting was a result of a tuberculosis scare that hit the city of Minneapolis, where it was thought at the time that you could transmit tuberculosis through spitting. And so they outlawed it. Now, we know that medical evidence has come forward saying that that's no longer the case. However, the law against spitting was used as a pretext to stop, frisk, harass, and criminalize young African-American men in the city of Minneapolis. And we're thinking, why is it 2015 and no one has gone back, looked at the laws and low-level ordinances on the books, conducted research, looked at the disparities, and made a change to those laws? Instead, when we confronted members of our city government, what we received were excuses about why it would be difficult in this political climate to take those laws off the books. And yet we rose up and we fought anyway. Law students from St. Thomas gathered with people from the community to advocate against a repeal of that particular law and a repeal against lurking. Even though I was a law professor for 14 years, I still can't tell you what lurking is. And yet, that was a law that was on the books in the city of Minneapolis where people were being criminalized for lurking. What we need to do is to look at the laws that we have on the books. We need to determine whether or not they actually promote public safety or whether they are harming citizens who are simply minding their own business, walking down the street, spitting on the sidewalk, or standing around and being viewed as criminals. The reality is many people who have low-level records, such as petty misdemeanors or misdemeanors, are being denied access to employment opportunities and housing for something that's known as collateral consequences. It's really sad in today's day and age where we talk about this notion of the American dream and people being able to achieve success, that we would bring them into a new form of slavery through our criminal justice system. And this is not just a new phenomenon for the 21st century. If you look historically at the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which was brought into law in 1865, we will see that Congress opened the door to slavery through the criminal justice system. The 13th Amendment was supposed to abolish slavery, but it says, I'm paraphrasing here, that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall be allowed, except if one has been duly convicted of a crime. Now, knowing the tremendous harms that slavery caused in this country, the fact that the African American community is still suffering the effects from the legacy and the brutality of slavery, why would our government leaders open the door to slavery through our criminal justice system? We heard earlier about policing starting out as slave patrols. Well, I would argue that when you look at the impacts of policing in inner city communities, it rivals some of the same issues that were present in the 1800s in terms of African Americans not feeling free in their own neighborhoods to walk the streets. And yes, we know that there are some people in various communities who commit crimes. And like Dr. King said, it's true and deplorable that some Negroes commit crimes, but they are derivative crimes. The greater crimes are those of the white society. And what he was talking about is the fact that we have set up conditions that make it very difficult for the poorest of the poor to survive and have a decent quality of life. And rather than opening the door to economic opportunity and correcting the wrongs of the past, we allow police forces to patrol those neighborhoods and to criminalize people who are often engaged in nonviolent, low-level offenses. The time for change is now. We all have a responsibility to shift the paradigm instead of continuing along with the status quo. Because as we have seen with the killing of Jamar Clark at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department, the killing of Philando Castile at the hands of the St. Anthony Police Department, this is not just something that's impacting people in other parts of the country. It's happening right here in our own backyard. So what are we going to do about it? Thank you.
So we have to rearrange a little bit.
So again, just to remind everybody, if you want to write a question out, please write it out, hold it up, and students will bring them up, and we will get them circulated up here. I want to give everybody a chance to respond to anything that they've just heard or clarify or add to any comments they made before. Artie?
I heard a lot of great things. One thing I wanted to touch on, Nakeem, I think you did a really great job that we've got to get real about race. And I have never seen a police officer take a child or some of those other things. But I'm a white guy, was a mayor and a crime reporter. It's highly unlikely I will. But I have seen enough videos to recognize inequitable police department coverage. I get that. But I also have been there many, many, many times when there have been police officers, white officers, very quietly doing remarkable work with people of color, too. And it is important for us to recognize, I have an idea, let's not clap for anything so we listen, okay? I so appreciate yours, but I just think it's really important for us to get into the nuance. The lurking ordinance, for instance, you are totally right, and you and others did a great service by coming in and looking at those low-level offenses. I'm old enough, and unfortunately was in the mayor position enough, to be with domestic abuse victims who wanted us to understand how to get that person outside their window. As you brought light to that, it clarified for me that the lurking ordinance that we used for that was too broad. Great work. What we need to do, however, is put that also within a context of public safety, because we do need to have a very honest conversation. Okay, do we want that person outside the window or not? Do I want to walk down the street and see panhandlers? We've chosen to say yes. We've said we don't want them to come up and ask me. So we've chosen to do that. The public needs to be part of deciding what we're going to ask our cops to do, and we just have to, one by one, look through these issues, and that kind of work we did was really great. But I do believe we need to fuse in what it is for those people of color in high crime neighborhoods who desperately ask for that too. The police cars that you rightfully see are overrepresented in those neighborhoods I also have been in those neighborhoods when I'm asked to desperately send more. So we just need to understand how to put all that together.
Mike?
Thank you. I just wanted to piggyback on what Mayor Ryback had to say. Within the public sector, we abide by this social contract, right? And so with us, we are doing what our community is asking of us, right? They want professional, progressive, proactive policing that's done impartially and it's done consistently that way. We're there to enforce laws, we're there to be guardians, we're there to protect civil rights in a republic where the majority rules. And with all of the external and internal influences that law enforcement and others have to contend with, it really is an impossible mandate. You know, and criminologists write about that impossible mandate. So I know that the social contract that we have has to change, and it will change, and it will be a part of this new era. What it looks like, I don't know. But this is the start of that process, right? Here today and in other conversations that are happening across the country. Because we need to know, what do you want from us? What laws do you want us to enforce? And if you don't want us to enforce them, then we got to get them off the books, right? Because we're left in a bit of a dilemma. Because we want to adhere to what our community wants, but if you don't want it, we got to know about it. And this is where this begins. So thanks.
Nikema?
I just want to respond to a couple things that were said. So, RT, we all know that there are good cops out there. Part of the problem is that anytime you talk about misconduct amongst officers or systemic issues of policing, people automatically get defensive. And they don't want to focus on the nuances of what we're talking about in terms of how the system functions. So I think that we can all agree there are good cops out there. However, I argue that a cop who witnesses abuse on the part of a fellow officer and remains silent or falsifies a report is not a good cop. So we need to be honest about that conversation as well. We also need to rethink our system of policing and what is the purpose. A lot of the low-level ordinances that I referenced earlier come out of this notion of broken windows policing, which many of us, especially people of color, feel is not only ineffective, but it widens the net of who is brought into the criminal justice system and causes a lot of unnecessary tension between police and community members because officers are constantly coming into those inner city communities. And when we're talking about enforcing certain laws, we look at the war on drugs. We know that that has largely been a failure. Over the last 40 years, the war on drugs has become a war on poor people of color and children, and more recently, women. So mothers of these children who are winding up in the system because of their connection to men who deal drugs. Many of the folks who've been caught up in the war on drugs are low-level and mid-level dealers. So we still have the kingpins, the high-level dealers out there making the money and recruiting those who they see as expendable to be brought into the drug war. And then we use police as agents to go into those inner city communities to catch those low-level dealers. And the reality is that if you are a person who's dealing drugs, you don't have a pension, you don't have benefits, you don't have a steady paycheck, your life is in danger. So if you had alternatives like job opportunities, it decreases the likelihood that people will become involved in the drug trade to begin with. So those are some of the conversations that I think that we need to be having as it relates to this overarching issue of policing.
Okay. Yeah, I think we need to really look at the issue of police discretion. I was glad to hear that here in Minnesota that there are, the training is really good. From what I, okay, well,
it is not.
Well, let me just say, because police officers exercise so much discretion, it's really critically important that they be trained. There is a scenario that is particularly unique, I think, to police culture. It's a quote I heard one time and it always stuck in my head. It says, as one goes down the police hierarchy, discretion increases. I want to repeat that. As one goes down the hierarchy, discretion increases, which means the cop on the street, on the block, has much more discretion than the executive, in the office. And there's an issue there. There's an issue because if that police officer is not trained appropriately, they're going to not use their discretion in the way in which they should. There was an LAPD transmission in one of those cases, Ramparts, whatever, back then, 70s or whatever, that said, evidence in the case, the quote went, "They give me a stick, they give me a gun, they pay me 50 G's to have some fun." Now, if that's the mentality that the cop on the street has, the low-level person who has the most discretion, then that's one of the genesis of the problems that we face in policing. So training is absolutely key.
Could I just say one thing on the training? I think it is great that we have high standards in this state, but I believe we've made a mistake in connoting a college education with what's needed. I would much rather have a police officer have a bachelor's degree in human relations than a bachelor's degree from a college. I don't believe we need a college degree anywhere nearly as much as we need cultural competency. I also believe one of the problems here is who's at the table. We want to have police at the table aggressively in this, but the dynamic of who gets elected within police departments is very strange. It is very often the most extreme voices. Minneapolis's head of the union, Bob Kroll, is absolutely not representative and is, I don't even believe, on the chart of reality of where policing is in this. People across the world are asking questions about America because of what Donald Trump says, but Donald Trump doesn't, I believe, represent the majority of America, and Bob Kroll doesn't represent the majority of police officers. So that is about police officers getting real in their elections, and they whisper this back and forth that they got to look each other in the eye and say no more sending extremists out there. What we need to do is to send good cops who represent the majority values of good cops to go out and have the good, tough, honest conversations. And Bob Kroll's not going to do that. And any cop listening, you look in the mirror and ask yourself, does Bob Kroll represent the cops of this town? He does not, and he's doing a tremendous disservice to the hundreds of good cops that I know.
Mike Freeman.
I think that we need to look into the future and not just in the past. The city of Minneapolis, Chief Harteau, had all of her officers undertake implicit bias training last year. That's impressive. She's talked about increased de-escalation training, which I think is absolutely critical to have. She's talked about mental illness training. She talked about crisis intervention. All of those training things are badly needed by cops and done. Chief Goldstein has done all those. We don't hear nearly the problems with the police in Plymouth, because he had the foresight and the size of the department. Changing the attitudes of the 800 plus members in the Minneapolis police force is worse than moving the Titanic. It takes time. But I'm at least impressed that the last couple of chiefs are moving in that direction, and we ought to support. Secondly, we can talk about prior grievances a lot, and that helps to set the stage. But sometime in this discussion, we need to talk about what we're doing going forward. We need to talk about how we can sit down and talk. And I'm very encouraged about being here today and talking with the folks. I think all of us want to talk. And it was very interesting just recently. You saw the difference between the folks in St. Anthony who got up and yelled at each other and hugged with each other in the end, and what happened in Falcon Heights, where the whole thing disintegrated. It was because I believe in St. Anthony, there were strong feelings, just as strong as elsewhere, but there was respect for each other and a willingness to listen. The old man taught me a lot of things. And one of the most valuable things is you don't learn anything when your mouth is open. And I think he was right.
Dr. Alexander, I have a question from a student. I think it might have been one of the students who came to lunch today, I'm guessing. But if you were giving a talk about police and their relationship to the community to a group of Black and Latino middle school students at an underfunded and failing school, what would you say to them? For example, how would you explain the concept of having certain rights, inalienable rights, when youth at risk have very little realistic opportunity to exercise them?
That got to be the hardest question of the century. So let me say this. Let me say a couple of things, if I may, in regards to some of the things I've just heard on stage. This is a very complicated, convoluted issue, but I think as a country, as a nation, I think we need to come to terms with the fact of this, is that this relationship between police and communities of color has been long-standing for a very long time, going back to slavery all the way up to today. And I think we have to note that. I think we have to be conscious of it. I think we also have to accept the fact merely because you did not see a 10-year-old kid slammed up against a car does not mean it does not happen.
Absolutely.
It just means you didn't see it.
Exactly.
Now, with the onset of technology that is out there for many years, historically, blacks have always said in communities, black and brown communities, is that the mistreatment of police is very apparent. But no one wanted to accept it or believe it merely because they said it. But now we can turn on our television every other day. We actually see a man running down the street and a police officer shoots him in the back 8 times, and there's no way in which you cannot question that. So we have the severity of these cases that exist. They're in our mind, they're in our psyche, and they're very real. I think what we have to do, quite frankly, how we recruit from day one, I don't care how much education we give our men and women, I don't care what school they're from or what community they're from, I think we have to recruit people who truly want to be guardians to a community. And I think you cannot keep a police officer in a community that is inundated with a lot of violence. You can't leave them there all their careers because they're human beings too. And they suffer eventually what is called PTSD we all commonly hear about. I think we have to pull those officers out. We got to make sure that those officers are healthy, as stated in the 21st Century Task Force report, Pillar 6. And so we got to take care of them. But we got to train different, we got to recruit different, and then we got to hold bosses responsible, their supervisors responsible for their actions out on their streets. Because I can train them in the academy, but once they get to those streets, I got to have responsible police officers who are senior officers theoretically in time, but not necessarily in maturity, to be responsible in making sure that they do their jobs as well. Now, to your question, and you're going to have to start the clock over here again. To your question, anytime that you're talking to young kids of color, particularly if they're growing up in a very challenged community or neighborhood, their reality is not your reality, merely because of a number of reasons. One is developmentally where they are at 13, 14, and 15, they're figuring out who they are. And they're also struggling with the normalcy of where they are developmentally, but they're also struggling with the abnormality of living in a community in which they themselves feel very threatened, in a community in which they do not feel safe. So it's not what I'm going to say to them, it's what I'm going to allow them to say to me. Because I need to hear and digest their reality and approve and accept whatever it is that they're experiencing, and not negate the fact that in their youth that what they're saying is not true, or try to attempt to tell them that what they're saying has no value. Because I didn't grow up the way that they did. We can't equate everyone that is black as being the same. I did not grow up poor. I did not grow up in the inner city. But does that mean I have a better understanding of what their troubles are than anybody else can have? What we have to have about ourselves is humanity, a love for people, period, regardless of where they're from or what they're doing. That's what we have to have, and that is what so often is missing. For those young kids in those communities, I don't need to say anything. I need to listen and validate what they are, what they're telling me, and how they feel. That's what's important, because I can never, ever find a word for them that's going to make them feel any difference in turn, because when that meeting is over with me and I walk out of that classroom and I go back to where I live and those kids go across the street to where they live, their reality is quite different. And I need to at least have an opportunity for them to feel validated in their reality in terms of where they are, in terms of trying to tell them what they're experiencing is not true.
All right, I think I'm going to direct this question to Mr. Freeman. It reads, I recently heard that 80% of the youth in detention in Hennepin County are African American males. How do we move further along in our race relations and our policing practices given that fact?
Well, I'm not certain that figure is absolutely correct, but there is a disproportionate number of young men of color, and particularly African Americans, in the juvenile justice system. I would be lying if I said otherwise. What we have done in the juvenile justice system, however, is reduce the percentage of kids in the juvenile detention facility by nearly 2/3. And that we reduce it of kids of color, and we reduce it for white kids. We have substantially reduced. We no longer arrest kids who didn't show up in court. Many times we find out they didn't know they were supposed to, or they forgot, or whatever. And if the dentist can remind you 2 days ahead of time that you got to come in, so can we. So we try to make some practical responses like that. We've also are fully aware that other than the most violent and serious juvenile offenders, they are usually not well served, being removed totally from their family and sent away off to a detention facility. That simply doesn't work. And I think the system was sending too many folks who really didn't need to be. People need to be with their families, and that's part of, we hope, restoring them and at the same time protecting society. So I think we're doing better, but there's no question it's a disproportionate number of African American males in our system. There are a whole lot of reasons for that that are different than the alleged racism of the cops, the county attorneys, or the judges, that we also need to deal with in this process. But let me assure the maker of the question, we know it, and we're doing something about it. And I'm very proud with the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative conducted by many people, including Judge Alexander, that we made some real progress, because only the kids that commit the most serious actions who really need to be removed from their home should be. A kid deserves to be home.
I have a question for anyone on the panel here. Should every police officer wear a body camera that is turned on while they're on duty? And if not, why not?
No. Vehemently, no. And here's the reality of that, and here's why I say that. I want transparency just as much as the next person. But if you can find anyone going forward who's going to take a job, put on a camera, you and I are partners, and we're riding down the street talking about our kids and their education, or talking about a personal issue, or just being human beings on any job as you would be on any job, or walking around the office or in roll call, and every part of our conversation is recorded, I promise you, you will not get a police officer to sign up anywhere in America. It ain't gonna happen.
Doctor, how about if we modify it and say,
Now,
how about if we turn it on when they have a citizen encounter?
Let's talk about when we should use body cameras. It's the interaction that that officer has with those in the community. That is important. If the whole idea behind body cameras are to be transparent during that interaction, during a call for service, on a traffic stop, whatever the case may happen to be, that is important information. It's within the context of doing their duty at that specific time, and that's what you want to have. Because the research points out that not only does it change the behavior of the police officer in terms of his or her interaction with the public, it also changes the public's interaction with the police as well, too. So the other piece you also need to consider in your community where you're taxpayers is that you're going to pay for the benefit of the storage of all of that footage and all of that information, and it is very costly. I think it's well worth it, but if you get a slight bump in your tax bill, oh, this guy here.
Not anymore.
Body cameras are important. It's a part of where we are today in our society. I think they're important in law enforcement. I think they're a tool. I think they're a good tool. And if used appropriately and used properly, they're going to benefit us overall in terms of the work that we're doing as we're advancing this profession into the 21st century.
So I'll just piggyback off of the body camera conversation. So we just had legislation passed in the state of Minnesota surrounding body cameras, and several civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and civil liberties organizations, including the ACLU, raised concerns about that body camera legislation because the language of the bill was skewed more towards the perspective of law enforcement than community members and those who have been victimized by police. Beyond that, there's so much discretion in the bill to allow individual departments to make decisions about when cameras should be turned on, when should they be turned off, and different things like that, that are critical in terms of accountability. What I saw as being a part of that legislative process and testifying was a lot of hostility towards those of us who were raising concerns about the gaps in that body camera legislation, which we did not think comported with best practices nationally. We faced hostility from some of our legislators who unfortunately did not really want to hear our voices. So we've heard a lot from some people on the panel about sitting down and having dialogue. There are many of us who have been at the table in many different settings time and time again who feel that we're just spinning our wheels, saying the same thing and not achieving results, and not seeing a sense of urgency in terms of actually addressing the systemic issues that we are talking about here. So it comes a point in time where you have to take a step away from the table, roll up your sleeves, and do something more significant as far as bringing about change. And that might mean going to the bodies that can change the laws and not just talking to them, but maybe it means sitting inside of the chambers of city council for hours until you finally get a hearing or your voices are being heard. It's sad that we have to take such drastic steps and spend so much time making these arguments and trying to advocate, but the reality is that it's very difficult for our voices to be heard. We don't have the political power as police unions have. So a lot of times they have political power, they have money, they have access, and there have been times when government officials have felt intimidated by police unions because of the political power that they hold. That again is something that we can't ignore as we're having this conversation.
Can I ask a question? Because I think this discussion on body cameras, it all happened after I left office. So let me ask that question just when you drew that line. I thought it seemed like a really bright line about in community. What about witnesses? What about when somebody is going out confidentially, a police officer is confidentially trying to get information for someone so they'll tell them something, and that person would feel very jeopardized if they were on camera? I'm asking this as an open-ended question. I don't know how to answer this.
Well, I think the one thing we have to keep in mind with body cameras, this is very new, and this is very new to all of us. And I think before it's over the years to come, we're going to see a lot of new case law written about the use of body cameras. But I think it's also important to note, too, in this country where you have 17,000 different police departments, and you have over 800,000 police officers across the country, every community in this country do not struggle with this issue that we're talking about today. Because some communities, maybe in suburban Minnesota or suburban Georgia, this may not be an issue for them. But we do know in many parts of our urban communities and even not so urban communities, this is an issue. So I think each community is going to have to define for itself what it is that it's willing to tolerate and allow in that community. But I think it's important for the citizens in that community, regardless of who you are, when you push back on organizations like the union, unions don't operate for the benefit of the public, they operate for the benefit of the men and women who pay union dues in that police department. So oftentimes what happens when they come with money, when they come with political resources, sometime at the state level, the greatest defense against unions in order to get what you need for your community and your police department is you, the citizens, saying to your union and your union representatives, we're not tolerating you going in another direction when we're going in this direction. Part of the problem is, oftentimes, is that many police departments will come to national meetings and chiefs will talk out of one side of their mouth over here and go down the hallway and talk out another side of their mouth. And I've seen it. But you also have to hold me, your chiefs, your elected officials, everybody accountable and responsible for delivering the same message all the time. Because if they don't, then nothing is going to benefit your community. You're going to find yourself in this awkward position of distrust and you're going to find yourself always right on the bubble of something happening that is not going to be the kind of community I think any of us want to be representative of.
Could I add just a quick data point about police unions? It's absolutely true that they have tremendous power at the state capitol to a point that is really galling to me. But in the city of Minneapolis, they do not. The public enemy number one for much of the time I was mayor was me, and I won elections by large margins. Public enemy number two was Betsy Hodges. She is currently the mayor of Minneapolis. Any of the places where they have endorsed people in city elections, they've often turned the race the other way. Rank and file police officers have respect. The police union does not have the respect of the people of Minneapolis, and no one should fear them in an election. Any elected official who's worried about the police union should be more worried about getting their endorsement. They should care about rank and file and not the union. I just want to be real.
All right. This next question is for Nkechi Taifa. And it seems at this point our relationship between citizens and police are so degraded that there's no way to build trust. Can this relationship actually be mended, or should we just start again from scratch?
Well, there are quite a number of people who say that we should start from scratch. There are a number of groups and organizations and movements that say we need to do away with the whole system of policing that in the manner in which we know, and we should in fact start from scratch. Then there's another side that says, well, reform is in fact possible. Let me just divert for just one moment, because one of the, as wonderful as this panel is, and with great applause for everyone who put this together, there is an entity missing from the discussion. And that might be part of the whole element as to what should we do? Should we scratch the whole system? When we need to reform the system? We need sometimes to be talking to the people who are directly impacted, not like me or Nikema who might have gotten arrested in civil disobedience or something like that, but people who are stopped daily unjustly, people who are being slammed against the car. Sometimes we need that perspective on the table, not just us from academia, from our professional purchase, but from people who are daily, impacted. And I would like to have them answer that question.
Okay, actually, I've got another question that I think is that kind of voice. So let me jump to that. My husband is 55 years old and black. He has worked 3 jobs for the last 25 years to send children to college. He doesn't swear, drink, and I'm afraid for him. He has been held at gunpoint in front of our home when we were moving in. He's been stopped in suspicion of a stolen vehicle, even though it was the wrong make, model, year, and color. What do we do about that? I think that's the kind of voice that you're talking about, and I'd ask Chief Goldstein, what would you say to that person?
Well, obviously they have a grievance, right? In that if that is indeed the case, where someone is misidentified and treated that way, there is, I would hope, recourse through the proper channels within whatever community that might have transpired.
Well, let me ask you this. What would the recourse be in your department?
Well, there would be an internal investigation as to what occurred, and the complainant would be a part, every step of that process, they would be a part of that. They would have the opportunity to come in and meet with the administration to express what happened. They would have an opportunity to give a statement. They would have an opportunity to understand the investigative process and the outcome.
But I think you're asking a systemic question, and not just a question that would be relegated to Plymouth, Minnesota, or to DeKalb County, Georgia. But I can go anywhere in the country and I can hear that same complaint of African-American men or men of color who feel arbitrarily stopped by the police with no reasonable cause or suspicion for that cop, or at least one is not articulated to them. Part of the problem is this, and some of you may agree and may not agree with me on this, is that the greatest majority of the work that police officers do out there every day is good work. They do make appropriate stops. They do stop based on reasonable and probable cause. The problem of where we are, my mother would kill me if you where we are, is that it's so enmeshed at this very moment. Someone can be legitimately stopped. I could be legitimately stopped out there as an older African-American male, and my first inclination could very easily be is that I'm unjustly being stopped. And there are people who are being unjustly stopped or confronted by police. But quite frankly, in the greatest majority of the cases that are out there, and I tell people this all the time, and people often ask me this, I don't know what to do as a person of color when I'm stopped by the police. I don't know whether to go somewhere where it's lit. I don't know whether to keep my hands on the steering wheel. I don't know whether to keep driving till I get home. I don't know what to do. So here's what I tell people quite often is because people say to me that if we look at the footage that's out there, African Americans are being stopped, and they say to the police officer, hey, I got a permit for a gun, I got my driver's license, get your driver's license, you get shot anyway. And that in the minds of people is hard to remove, right? When they see that. But even though those events should not occur under those circumstances, and I'm not judging any of these cases because I think these cases need to be properly investigated, go before a court of law. But the perception is there's something very wrong with people of color being stopped and being shot. So people say, I don't know what to do. But I always would tell people this, regardless of what, you always comply with the authority. Because you only have two options, to comply or not comply. If you don't comply, the situation is going to do what? It's going to escalate in all cases. But if we just comply to the authority, even if we think we're wrong, you're not going to win that battle on the street. You won't win it on the street. Because in the end, what needs to happen is that you need to make that complaint against that officer. That's what you need to do, is make the complaint. But oftentimes what we're seeing a lot of, and I'm seeing a lot of scapegoating by a lot of young men as well too, is that every time they are stopped, and they could be criminally wrong, and the first thing that they will say is that they're being harassed. We have to be very careful to make sure that we look and we judge each case individually. But there is something in this country that is wrong inherently and systemically in policing, and I think it has a lot to do with the way the laws are written. It has a lot to do with the way people are trained. It has a lot to do with attitudes that are both implicit and still explicitly biased towards people of color in this country. But I think it's important that we step back and we try to look at it in some objective way. But I will never tell anyone not to comply. And you should not tell anyone that. You comply with the authority. But there are people who will tell people, don't comply. But there are millions of traffic stops that are being made across this country at this very moment. And the greatest majority of them end without incident. But the ones that do end horribly bad are the ones that we see the image of. But that is not all the stops that take place out there. But we do know that there are some improprieties out there that must be dealt with, I think, legitimately.
All right, Professor Levy-Pounds.
While I understand Dr. Alexander's point, that very point about all the traffic stops that happen that don't end in violence or someone being killed is often used as a justification for once people are killed, saying, well, that person had to be doing something wrong.
That's right. You're right. You're absolutely right.
So I want to push back against that a little bit. The cases in which officers have killed an unarmed person, which are the cases that Black Lives Matter largely focuses on, are one facet of a broader problem. You have however many hundreds or thousands who are stopped on a regular basis. And a lot of times, if they are not killed by police, we overlook the criminalization of those individuals and the fact that it connects to our larger system of mass incarceration, where we now have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. That has to be a part of the conversation because it really helps to If we begin to talk about this issue of mass incarceration, it helps us peel back the layers even more and figure out, well, what is the purpose of policing to begin with? We know that we want police to address serious crimes in our community. What we don't want is standard behavior by people or poor judgment to be criminalized and to cause people to cycle in and out of the system on our dime. You know, where we're paying in any given year in Minnesota upwards of $30,000 to $40,000 a year per person. Some of them, again, nonviolent offenders. Many of them with mental health issues or underlying drug addiction issues. The other aspect of police stops that we have to look at is the profit scheme that is related to why some people are pulled over, which we saw in Ferguson,
Missouri.
And
Absolutely.
as we saw in the place in Falcon Heights, where Philando Castile was killed, where many black men would argue that that particular stretch of town was a speed trap. And it was in a place where racial profiling often happened and where there was no recourse for people who were being pulled over. So I think it's easy for us to tell people comply, follow the process, you'll get justice. But when you have been on the other side of that, you realize that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get justice under those
But let me ask a question. In real time, if you're stopped out there, what would you tell a person? What do you do in that moment in real time? You comply or not comply? What would you say? I understand the larger systemic issue that we got to address, and everything you're saying
It's
is
suicide not to tell them not to comply. Unfortunately, sometimes it's suicide when they do comply. But I agree with you. You absolutely have to tell them to comply. I mean,
that's the only point I'm making.
But what I want to say, what I would like to do is, I like to see the hands of everyone in this audience who feels that they have ever been unjustly stopped by police. Let me see your hands. Actually, there are more hands raised than I thought there would be in this particular audience, but maybe I should discern the hue of the skin. But when I'm in a majority black audience, just about every single hand goes up. But one of the things that's very interesting is that I keep talking about training and discretion and all like that, but to tell you the truth, bottom line, police have discretion. They know when they are in majority white communities, they don't act the same as when they are in majority black communities. They do not. They reassess the situation. They use that discretion wisely. I've seen that even on tape in Washington, in Georgetown, a predominantly white, wealthy part of the city. I mean, the words this white woman would say, oh my God, I would never even dream anyone in the black community saying something like that to a police officer and expecting to live. But he was very deferential, gave her his name and his badge, his telephone number, and all of the differences are astronomical. So police officers know, there is something systemic here with respect to unequal justice based on the communities we're in. And I know we don't want to hear that. I know we ourselves, well, I'm not racist, et cetera, et cetera. That's why we use the term implicit bias. It's not your fault, et cetera. So, but they know how to do it, I guess is what I'm saying. They just need to do it across the board wherever they may be.
But it's also really important for white people to enter this discussion because what you are saying, I believe, is correct, and it makes me physically sick when I think about what you had to tell your son and me not. And it is really important. This is not a black issue. This is a all of us issue. And we got to get into this realm here.
I just wanted, one of the goals today is some common ground. So, I'm part of the establishment. I'm a prosecutor. The city of Minneapolis reviewed their policy of police chasing civilian cars through neighborhoods and cut that back profoundly. I think it's time for all of us to look profoundly at who's getting stopped, when are they getting stopped, and for what? Because I, for one, can put up with a lot of cracked taillights instead of having the excuse of stopping certain people because they have a cracked taillight and not others. And so you did some great work that came up on spitting and lurking, which made no sense. I think police departments and prosecutors and citizens need to look at the use of the tool of stopping people for minor traffic violations, excuse me, and the abuse that's occurred. And I'll be in the front with you on that one.
So, Chief Goldstein, this is to shift the focus a little bit. The Star Tribune recently reported that you have written about the need for police to be mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually fit, that there is a need for a holistic view of wellness for those in law enforcement. Could you expand on that? And I'd like to invite others to address that.
Well, thank you. It is one of the pillars of the 21st Century Policing Report. And while the authors of that report did not place any of the pillars in any particular order, I would argue that that is the most important pillar in that, again, as I stated when I spoke earlier, if you have broken police officers, you're not going to have effective policing. Our officers are the ones that carry out the mission. And there's an old military adage, if you don't take care of your troops, you can't carry out your mission. So for us to be effective, we have to ensure that our folks are physically fit, emotionally fit, psychologically fit, and spiritually fit. And in our organization, we've been very intentional about that. We have policies in place, we have programs in place that cover each of those 4 aspects. And it's done very well, and it's growing, in fact. We're actually going to be doing something more in 2017 with it. We're trying to get others to understand that, and for county commissioners and city council members to invest in that too. Because again, as we stated in that community forum that we had with the faith leaders from North Minneapolis, and they talked about explicitly how they were tired of dealing with broken police officers, that they want good, effective policing, and they need healthy officers to do it. That is something that I'm committed to. That's something that our Chiefs Association is committed to, and we're going to try to help in that regard so that we can have officers that are better fit to do the job that they're asked to do, no matter how that job changes over the course of through these conversations.
Okay. Said.
Yeah, so just a point of interest in terms of what you just heard the chief say, and I certainly have heard other chiefs say that as well too, is that Pillar 6 should have been Pillar 1. And being one of the 11 authors of the 21st Century Task Force Report, here's why building trust and legitimacy was number 1. That is the basic fundamental foundation of a relationship between police and community. It all starts there. Now, that mental health piece being in Pillar 6 does not in any type of way suggest it's not written in the sense of importance. If you look at the total document, you have to look at the whole document, all of it. Pillar 1 or Pillar 6 is just as important as Pillar 3 or 4 or 2 or 1. And a lot of discussion went around police officer welfare. And I'll give you a good example. In one of the suggestions I made in Pillar 6 was that when we were talking about police officers who committed suicide, and if they committed suicide, they would not receive any of the benefits that would normally be afforded to them, correct? Because it was suicide. I presented the argument as this, as a psychologist. If that police officer has a reported stressor or a diagnosable psychological condition while he or she is serving in that department, and if they're receiving treatment, and if somewhere along the way they commit suicide, and you can tie it back to the stressors that come along with that job, which suggests that it was dated during the time that they were under treatment, whatever the case may happen to be, they should be afforded all of the insurance compensation that anyone else is afforded. That is the right thing to do. Because the way it is now, if a police officer suicides, and we know that there's a high rate of suicide in that population, then their families won't receive anything. But a direct causation to their suicidality may be related to the work that they and the stressors they worked up for years. So I would encourage everyone in here to Google 21st Century Task Force Report and take a look at it for yourself and study it, because it is a document of its time.
Great.
But I also want to note this. I want to applaud Chief Goldstein for adopting the 21st Century Task Force Report. because there's still chiefs off there across this country who will not adopt it merely because it was proposed and suggested by President Obama. How much sense does that make? That's just like saying, I need water to survive, but I'm not going to take your water because it's coming from you. It doesn't make sense. It's ignorant. It's crazy. But here's what does make sense. Many departments across this country, virtually every one of your largest and most reputable police organizations, from IACP, PERF, Noble, all of them have adopted the 21st Century Task Force report. We're moving forward with it, regardless of who the next president may be, because we know that we got to do something different in this country, and until somebody else writes something different or propose something different, we can't criticize the document. We have to use that as a potential roadmap to help move us and advance us forward. And I think you're very fortunate to have a chief like Chief Goldstein, who supports and upholds the 21st Century Task Force in his community and across your immediate community here in Minneapolis, because that is huge. That is absolutely huge. But in no way, Chief, was police officers ever minimized in this whatsoever, because myself, Chuck Ramsey, and one or two other chiefs who sit there made sure that our interest was also attended to as well.
The next question is directed to Chief Goldstein, although it goes to an issue that I'm sure others could address as well. And it's this: can you and I really have a genuine dialogue when you're carrying a gun and I'm not?
I would like to think so, right? I mean, I think what we have to do, the question was, can we have a conversation about finding common ground when I'm carrying a gun and you're not, okay? So I would like to think so. I mean, it's a tool of my job. I'm not a gun guy, right? I mean, I've actually been criticized because of my stance on guns, but it is a part of what I wear when I go to work. It's a part of me. It's not who I am. And I would like to look at the human dignity piece that we talked about before, and the intentional and constructive conversations that we need to start to have. And I know it's easier said than done, and it sounds almost insensitive, but we have to remove some of the emotion, even though that's very hard to do, but to get in and to start working through the issues so that we can, as Mr. Freeman said, move forward. I firmly believe that we've vented now. We've had the opportunities to express our discourse, but now we need to move forward. And so I would hope that the uniform, I even asked, should I even be in uniform today? Is that going to be a barrier? I'm proud of what I do. I'm proud of what I wear. I'm proud of what we represent. But I don't want that to be a barrier to future conversations.
Can I ask a quick question? Is that okay? Because I'm just curious. Why is it that it appears as if lethal force, i.e. the guns, in many instances seems to be the first recourse, at least within the cases that have become meteorized?
Well,
as opposed to lower levels
Right.
of,
Going back to even what Robert Peel said, you know, use of force should be the last resort, right? So 95% of what we do is done with our mouth. It's all about talking. It's all about conversation, about communication. There are times, though, where force is used in order to gain compliance. And we have to be reasonable in the force that we use. That's what we're judged on in the court, by the courts, and hopefully by public opinion. However, there have been abuses. There's no doubt about it. Extreme transgressions that cost people their lives that should never, ever have died. But for the most part, there's 60 million contacts a year that police have with the public. And when you look at the numbers, yes, some people are killed in those encounters, but the ratio is very, very small, right? I mean, physicians kill a lot more people by accident than we do in law enforcement. We have to use the tools that are given to us, and those tools are improving through different technology. We're trying to de-escalate, we're trying to slow things down, we're trying to bring more people in so that we don't have solo officers making rash decisions under pressure that they can't necessarily appropriately control or perceive. But it's not always going to be perfect. And when force is used, it's never pretty. Whether it's escorting someone, whether it's using a taser on someone, or God forbid, whether it's shooting someone. It's not going to be pretty. That's not our first choice, right? And for anybody that it is their first choice, they're in the wrong profession and they should be locked up. So,
Let's
Yeah,
try
I
and...
was just going to say, any unnecessary death is one too many.
yeah.
And we have to be careful about not minimizing the impacts of that one death on an entire community. If you look at the murder of Jamar Clark at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department, that community is still grieving very heavily as a result of what happened. You go by the memorial, it's a tree near a few feet from where Jamar Clark was killed. Think about the kids who have to get on and off of a school bus every day and walk past the tree where they know an unarmed black man was killed within a few feet. That's something that they will carry forward with them into their futures. And even as we're having this conversation where we're talking about remove emotion and stop venting, for us, this is not about venting and it's not about emotion, it's about the truth and justice and being able to live a decent quality of life as a resident of this country and to stop having to feel like second and third class citizens in a country in which our ancestors labored for free. That is fundamentally a part of what has to happen here. We can't forget about the past. We can't ignore what's happening in the present for the sake of trying to move forward. How can anyone move forward when these are still unresolved, unreconciled issues? I know Minnesota Nice loves for us to move forward and gloss over the truth, but there are many of us who are saying we refuse to move forward until we begin to actually address the current issues that are on the table that are still not being resolved. If you look at the shooting of Jamar Clark, after that 18-day occupation in front of the 4th Precinct, and the news cycles went on to something else, people in society think you're supposed to move on to something else and not actually take the time to grieve. And beyond that, what systemic reforms have we seen as a result or in the aftermath of the shooting death of Jamar Clark? I would argue none. And with Philando Castile, we face the same concerns about once the news cycles die down, it's no longer national and international news. Not only is there a question of whether Philando's family will get justice, but what fundamental systemic changes will happen to ensure that something like that does not happen again in the state of Minnesota. We don't have any assurances that that's the case. So for me personally, I will keep my emotion on the table because somebody has to have some moral outrage about this crisis in policing that we're facing and the uneven society that people of color and poor people are forced to contend with.
We'd like to end on a positive note. So what I'm going to ask or invite each of you to do is to very briefly state something that you heard tonight by somebody on the other side that you would be willing to build a bridge or help try and find common ground to, particularly the local people, but also Nikichi, Cedric. Let's say something positive to each other so that when we continue this conversation, we're coming back together to try and do something together.
Well, you know, I don't know if it's so much anything positive I have to say as much as it is that I'm not going to take the issue that is going on between police in this country and communities of color and try to soften this. I think what is important is, yes, we have to keep the dialogue, but I think to Nakima's point is that the psychological trauma that the emerging young kids in communities all across this country, and even adults like yourself and myself, when we see these images, what appears to be just flat out murder, and if that's what is in our minds and in our brains, and these young kids have to walk through these neighborhoods and see this, and the only thing that they know is that 2 police officers killed this black man, and whether they were indicted or not indicted, the fact of the matter is they see themselves and they see their friends or they see a family member, and then they turn on TV and they see it again in some other part of the country. So here's what I would say to Minnesota, as I would say to the rest of the country, is that What we have to do is not just continue to talk about this, but each and every one of us, all of us that are in this room, regardless of who we are, where we're from, we have to take a responsibility to try to make something different for the betterment of everyone. Because if any part of our communities are weak, then all of us as a nation are just as weak as well too. Even if you don't think that it affects you, it does. I live in suburban America too, but I know what goes on in my urban communities is directly and indirectly impact my life every day, and it impacts all of our lives. And we have to not just talk about this, but we certainly have to be part of making something very different and changing something in our environment.
I want to answer that by answering that question that was asked about how would you talk about police and inequity to school kids. And I think what I would do if I was running that classroom is I wouldn't mention cops at all. I'd put them in a room and we'd sit in a big circle and we'd talk about what kind of actions we want to have in that classroom, how we want it to be, whether we talk together, whether people have to raise their hands, whether people can go to a bathroom break. We decide what kind of a classroom atmosphere we have. And then we say, because the schoolwork is so important, what we're going to do is have most of you focus on that, and we're going to have 2 of you in charge of making sure that everybody follows those rules. So those people are now put on the outside of that circle. And then we'd do that for a little while, and then we'd begin to talk about the fact that those 2 people were actually doing what we asked police officers to do, for us to set community values and for us to have some of the people enforce those so the rest of us could go about our lives. Then I'd spend a lot of time trying to understand what it was like to see your friend trying to ask you to do something and get the impact and what that meant for that person. Then the next lesson I'd have would be one about race and culture, and I'd get into why we have inequity in this country. Race, racism, and the many other pieces of it. And you begin to walk through all of this and you recognize there's a lot behind this, but getting to the solution is unbelievably hard, but it's totally achievable if we do not start with cops, but we start with ourselves. And we put ourselves in the center, what kind of a community we want, who do we want to be, how do we treat those who enforce that, and how do those who enforce it recognize they're working for us?
I would like to say that people from different historical backgrounds, different experiences, different viewpoints in life can in fact come together to achieve change. And I just got to point out, Professor Mark Osler is a former prosecutor. I'm a former defense attorney. But what we have teamed up to do in Washington has been absolutely extraordinary. Unless we can talk to people who come from different experiences, we'll never be able to make change. Yeah, I can talk to the chief of police, to line officers who are out there, et cetera, et cetera. If I can pick up the phone and talk to the general counsel of Koch Industries, if I can have lunch with the president of Prison Fellowship, Chuck Colson's organization, I'm just saying, in order to effectuate change, in order to get legislation passed, we surely should be able to talk to people who have been sworn to protect us in society, and it absolutely has to happen, and it must happen. The police and the community need to come together. I think that the President's 21st Century Task Force on Policing is a first step, but it can't just stay up in the ivory towers. It needs to devolve down to the community. And I will say this, I'm not quite sure, I don't know if you know what's happening. I've been working with Roy Austin, and they have been working with some psychologists and the like, looking to break down that very voluminous document into sizable portions so that the community can start holding the police accountable. So the community understands what is in each of those pillars and understands that police officers are not supposed to be social workers. Social workers are supposed to be social workers. Police officers are not supposed to respond to every single, that's not what they are trained to, that's not what they should be trained to do. So it's systemic, we need to change. But unless we come together, and I submit that we can, because we have done so in other aspects as well, that's the only way we're going to be able to achieve change, to effectuate justice.
You know, in my life, I've spoken after Paul Wellstone and Hubert Humphrey Sr. I don't want to talk after you, girl. No way, no way. And Hank, thank you for doing this, but you used the word the other side. That's not common ground. We're not on the other side. We're not on the other side. We do We have different roles, we have different functions. Prosecutors have a different function than public defenders. We need to respect them, we need to listen to them, and we need to work with them to make the system work. That's what this is all about. And what I enjoy about today, is the respect that everybody's paid to each other. The viewpoints, I don't have anything wrong with passion, I got a little of that myself. But what I appreciate is people listening and respectful. I was on NPR last week with 5 African American men, 1 a chief of police, and 4 folks who had different kind of interactions with the cops. I learned a lot, and I tried to share a little bit what our perspective is to do it. I came away enriched, and I hope the other folks did too. So that's what I take away from tonight, and I thank Hank and Mark and St. Thomas for doing it, and for you all, so we could really talk together.
Yeah, I think, again, it drives me a little batty when we talk about the other side. You know, what did I learn from the other side? I think what I heard tonight reinforces what I've been feeling, what I've been trying to learn and understand. It is a systemic issue. It's about the police, but it's about more than the police. And until we recognize that, and until, as good as the 21st Century Policing report is, until there's money behind it to fund some of the initiatives that we really need to do on a national scale, we're not going to get the fixes as easily as we should. So I respect everything that was said. I agree with some, not with all of it, but I do believe that we're better for this experience, and I look forward to a brighter future because, you know, I don't like this phrase, but at the end of the day, we're in this together. It's not about us versus you. It's about working together to provide safe communities where the quality of life is that where we can feel good and comfortable about where we are, what we're doing, without the fear of any sort of oppressive force. And that's what I'm shooting for. Pardon the pun. That's what I'm trying to get to. Foot and mouth.
Implicit.
Good God. So anyhow.
You got 3 seconds to
That's
dig your way up.
Yeah, I know, dig my way up. That's where we're headed, and so thank you for the opportunity.
I want to thank all the panelists for having the courage to participate in this conversation. It's definitely not easy, knowing that people have a variety of different opinions and sometimes they represent different offices and there's politics involved. So I'm thankful that you each engaged in this conversation. And I would say that my words are probably more for the audience than for this panel, that we need to be willing to embrace uncomfortable situations and tension if we are going to move towards justice. I know that there's a lot of discomfort when we bring up matters of race relations, when we bring up police-community relations, when we bring up poverty, but having those honest conversations and being willing to peel back the layers is the only way that we're going to move towards change. It takes being authentic. It takes being uncomfortable. It takes embracing tension for us to move towards justice. Thank you.
So we're now going to recognize University President Julie Sullivan for a few closing comments.
Thank you. I don't think I want to follow any of these speakers. But in closing, I do want to thank Dean Vischer, Professor Shea, Professor Osler, for bringing us together. I want to thank all of you for being here. I particularly want to thank our panelists. I will echo the remarks. It takes courage, and it took courage for each of you to be here and to be genuine and to be authentic. We all come to this difficult discussion with perspectives that are shaped by the paths we've walked and the shoes we've worn. We will only find common ground if we can have a better understanding of what it's like to walk in others' shoes. And I thank our panelists for helping give us some of that perspective. Clearly, this is a dialogue that must continue. We are addressing some very deep. The word systemic has probably been the most frequently used word today, but we're addressing some very deep and complex issues. And I hope that today's dialogue will help us continue the dialogue so we ultimately get to some solutions that will help us live in a more just, humane world where the dignity of every human person is respected and we're all doing our jobs to the best of our ability. I'm proud that as a Catholic institution, we are being proactive, not to avoid the hard questions, not to blithely explain them away, but to delve into them honestly, earnestly, and with passion that our faith tradition demands. I'd like to end with a brief scripture and a brief prayer, because I think prayer is what will give us the foundation to continue our dialogue. In the Hebrew scriptures, the prophet Micah gives us a simple but very challenging formula for holiness. He writes, "This is what Yahweh asks of you, only this, to act justly, to love tenderly, and to walk humbly with your God." So as we depart this evening, we turn to our God, our Creator, in prayer. God of us all, please walk with each of us in the coming days, weeks, and months. Help us to make your love more present, your unity more visible, and your justice more real in our families, our neighborhoods, our country, and beyond. Amen, and peace be with you.
Thank you.